Hello and welcome. My name is Eric and today we're going to be talking about basic camera terminology. When I say basic, I mean very basic. My goal here is to give you an introduction to your camera, to show you some of the buttons, little icons, explain some of the lenses, and also explain some of the questions that you may be getting. My sister just got her first DSLR and she's been asking me a ton of questions, and I figured, hey, make a video on it, share it with you, and hopefully help somebody out that may not have a totally awesome brother like me. First thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is how long your sensor is exposed to light. On your camera, you're going to see something that'll either say 1/60, 1/125, something like that. That is your shutter speed. Occasionally, especially if you're using the live view function, it may just show 60 or 125. Now, this is less than a second of exposure, which is most common. You can, on some cameras, go as high as like 30 seconds or even a full hour long exposure on the really expensive ones. This usually you won't be using because it's meant for landscape, architecture, something that doesn't move. Now, when you're shooting handheld, as I imagine most of you will, you're going to want to keep that above 1/60th of a second. And again, that may not say 1/60, it may just say 60. The reason why this is important is because it does control blur or shake on your camera. So if you go less than 1/60th, for the most of us, if you do less than that and you're taking the photo, sometimes you push down the trigger or you push down the shutter really hard, and that's going to cause a little bit of motion blur when you're taking your photos. Generally, the higher you get, the more sharper you're going to get. Now, if you want to freeze action, you definitely want to use a high shutter speed. Each camera is going to have a different maximum shutter speed, but you can definitely check out what the highest shutter speed on your camera is. Now, having a high shutter speed can be a lot of fun. You can freeze some action, get some funny pictures like this. But also you can get some cool effects with slow shutter speed that'll look something like this. Shutter speed on video is a little bit different. For the most part, what you're going to want to do is you want to keep your shutter speed double whatever your frame rate is. Now, I know I used some terminology there. So when you go into your camera and you look at the different modes that it offers for video, so you'll see like 1080p at 60 frames per second, or you may just see 1080p at 29.97 frames per second. Some of you, if you got a higher end camera, you may see 4K at 29.97. Whatever that second part is, you want to take your shutter speed and do roughly the double that. And that's going to give you a nice cinematic look. You can experiment with higher shutter speeds, lower shutter speeds. I know some people use them. I pretty much stick to that rule of doubling it up all the time because that's just what I do. Next up, what we have is aperture. Now, aperture is measured in a fraction. A lot of people hear fraction, they freak out, don't worry about it. If you see a weird number on your camera, like a 2.0, 5.6, 16 is not really a weird number, but you get the idea. If you get that, that is your aperture. Now, all that is how big the hole in your lens actually is. The most important takeaway from this is that the lower the number, the bigger the hole. The higher the number, the smaller the hole. The reason why that's important, it's going to control something, which is our next vocab word, is depth of field. Now, depth of field is basically how much of your subject, which your subject is whatever you're photographing, in this case it would be me, how much of your subject in front and behind is in focus. If you want to pull focus to your subject, such as what I'm doing now, you can get a blurred background by using a low aperture. Now, this means that the hole in front of your lens is going to be bigger. If you're ever shooting a group of people, you want to make sure you use a relatively higher aperture so that way you have everybody in focus. Now, when I say high, it's really relative. The reason is that your camera, sensor, and lens are all going to dictate what your depth of field actually is. Again, my suggestion is to experiment with your camera, take a ton of photos using different apertures and seeing how much you have in focus. Next up, what we have is ISO. Now, this is how sensitive your sensor is to light. This is usually going to be the last thing that you're going to want to adjust. The reason is that the higher the ISO, the more noise or little artifacts you may potentially get in your image. To identify ISO on your camera, it's usually going to be a number that's between 100 and can go as high as like 100,000 on some of the higher end cameras. How well your camera handles high ISO is what's known as low light performance. To figure out how well your camera does handle high ISOs, just take a bunch of pictures, take a bunch of footage, change the ISO for each one, and see what you consider to be not looking well or a poor image quality. Now, there are going to be a couple modes on your camera that you may want to use. Some of those are going to include aperture priority and shutter priority. In shutter priority, you set the shutter speed, your camera will change the aperture and ISO to get a correct exposure. Or exposure is really just the correct amount of light. That way you have all your highs, all your lows, without losing too much in between, or at least as best as it can do that. For aperture priority, as you probably guessed, it's the same thing. You set the aperture, your camera's going to take care of the shutter speed and ISO. Definitely use these modes when you're starting out to experiment, learn a little bit more about these concepts, because really the best way to really get these ingrained in your head is just take a ton of photos, take a ton of video, and see what happens. When you're working with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, shutter speed and aperture do increase and decrease at the same increments. Now, I'm not going to worry about telling you what that's called because I feel like it's just going to confuse you. All you need to know is that if you're taking a photo and you like the way it looks, you like how much light it is, you like the way everything is exposed properly, you like the highlights, you like the darks, if you like the photo, but let's say you want to take your aperture down a bit, you can turn your aperture down by 1 increment and you can increase your shutter speed increment and you're going to get the same exact exposed image, meaning all the light that's there will be the same. Same thing in reverse as well. I wish somebody had told me that when I first started out. So to do a quick recap, shutter speed is how long your sensor is exposed to light, aperture is how big the hole is inside of your lens, and ISO is how sensitive your sensor is to light. Next up, all the terms that we have are all about lenses. Now, if you do not have a camera that has interchangeable lenses, meaning you can't change the lens on the front of it, this will still benefit you in understanding what you're doing, what you're using, and why you're using it. First term for lenses is focal length. There's really only a couple things you need to know about focal length. Without actually telling you what focal length is, all you really need to know is that it's this little number right here on your lens. This only has 1, sometimes on your lens, which I believe most of you, especially if you got a lens in your kit, which is known as a kit lens, pretty self-explanatory, you're gonna have 2 numbers, such as this one where it has 70 to 200. So if you have a lens or 2 that came with your camera and somebody says, hey, what lens do you have? You just look at the number, that's what they're asking you. The reason why this is important is because it's telling you how much your field of view is in your camera, or approximately, which I'm going to get to in a minute. Second thing you need to know is that focal lengths, you'll hear wide angle and telephoto. Sometimes you'll hear the term standard. Really what this means, if it's higher than 50 millimeters, it's considered telephoto. If it is 50 millimeters, sometimes people refer to that as standard. If it is below 50 millimeters, it's considered wide angle. There are a lot of other characteristics that this will change about your image, but for now we're not going to go into that. Next up, what we're going to talk about is prime and zoom. So prime lenses like this one means that they just have 1 focal length. So this is a 100 millimeter macro. It will never shoot anything other than a 100 millimeter macro. Zoom lenses, as you probably have guessed, have 2 focal lengths. So this one is a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. That means it can shoot 70 millimeters, 200 millimeters, or anything in between. Prime lenses are usually going to give you a bit of a sharper image, meaning you're going to get a bit finer detail. Whereas the zoom lenses give you the versatility of being able to not have to change your lens anytime you want to switch your focal length. Now, the other thing to know about focal length is actually kind of important. All the focal lengths that you see printed on any lens is all relative to a 35 millimeter full frame sensor. Now, that is just a size of a sensor. If you do not have that sensor, then the focal length on your lens is not actually true. If you know that you have a full frame camera, then you know that whatever focal length you're using is actually true. All other sensors have something known as a crop factor. To know this, all you need to do is do a quick Google search, type in crop factor, and whatever model of camera you have, and it will tell you that. I believe for Canon it's 1.6, not totally sure on that. Nikon I believe is 1.4, and then as you get into different types of sensors or different size sensors, then you have different crop factors for that. So if you want to know what focal length you're actually shooting at on your camera, then what you do is you take whatever focal length it says on your lens or camera, and then you multiply it by your crop factor. Last term we're going to talk about is fast lens. Now this one is just the most roundabout term I have come across when talking about cameras or lenses. So bear with me on this. If somebody says, do you have a fast lens? Or, hey, you need a faster lens to do that. What they're actually telling you is that you need a lens that is capable of a lower aperture. The reason why it's called a fast lens is because if you were to take a photograph at its most widest aperture or its lowest aperture, then you need a faster shutter speed in order to compensate to get a correct exposure. I tried coming up with a better name for it. I couldn't. If you think of one, definitely leave it in the comments below. But that's what somebody's talking about when they say fast lens. Now for the end of this video, I'm going to tell you how to create those nice, dreamy, soft background looks. In my experience, the most common reason why people change from a phone to a higher end camera is that they want to be able to take those photos. Now Apple and Google have both gotten a lot better with their portrait mode, and I do not remember what it's called on Google, but I know they're both awesome. But this is how you do it actually in camera without needing any algorithms. You're going to take your camera, set your aperture as low as it'll go, change your shutter speed and ISO to compensate for that, and that is how you get the nice blurred background in your pictures. That's going to be it for this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you do have any additional questions, definitely leave them in the comments below. If you do like the content, please hit that subscribe button. Do always remember to love yourself, and I cannot wait to share the next video with you guys.